From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings in London, Max Robinson in Chicago, and from our desk in Washington, Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. On the 87th day of captivity for American hostages in Iran, there has been a dramatic development concerning other Americans in Iran, who probably would also be hostages today, except for good luck and the goodwill of Canada. The 6 Americans, all government officials, were not in the U.S. Embassy when it was seized on November 4th. Eventually, they sought and were given sanctuary in the Canadian Embassy and remained in hiding there until very recently, when, with the help of the Canadians and phony Canadian passports, they managed to get out of Iran. We have a complete report on how it all happened and the first reaction to the news in Iran. First, here is diplomatic correspondent Ted Koppel at the State Department.
As the American embassy was seized on November 4th, the 6 Americans immediately looked for places to hide. Some of them were actually inside the compound when it was taken over. They escaped unnoticed through a rear gate. Among the 6, 2 married couples, Mark and Cora Lyjak, Joseph and Kathleen Stafford, all consular officials. Another consular official, Robert Anders, and the agricultural attaché, Henry Lee Schatz. Initially, the 6 found refuge in a number of different locations, among them 2 West European embassies. Within a few days, though, they all made their way to the Canadian Embassy.
During their stay in the Canadian Embassy, there was no direct contact between them and the U.S. government.
The central figure at this point was the Canadian ambassador to Iran, Kenneth Taylor. He was in touch with his government in Ottawa. They were in touch with Washington. A decision was made to gradually reduce the staff of the Canadian Embassy, smuggling the U.S. diplomats out as part of that staff.
We had been gradually reducing the staff, looking for the opportunity when we could both take out the Americans who were staying in our embassy and the few remaining diplomatic staff that presented itself over the weekend.
The distraction, the Iranian presidential elections.
The preoccupation of the people in Iran with the elections and subsequently seemed to our officials there to be the best possible time to make a move.
The Americans left Iran carrying Canadian passports in the company of Canadian diplomats aboard regularly scheduled commercial flights. They're expected to arrive here in the United States sometime today. The U.S. government is being especially tight-lipped about the entire operation, the lingering fear being what will happen now to the remaining 53 U.S. citizens in Iran and to those Western diplomats who remain behind. Ted Koppel, ABC News at the State Department.
The 3 American clergymen who visited the hostages in Tehran on Christmas Eve knew at the time that other Americans were hiding in the Canadian Embassy. Bishop Thomas Gumbleton of Detroit told ABC News today that he and the 2 other clergymen had been told very confidentially that Americans were inside the Canadian Embassy and that just on the outside chance they were able to bring back the American hostages, the others should not be left behind. Peter?
Frank, in Tehran, the news that the diplomats had escaped was as much of a surprise as it was everywhere else. American correspondents, as you know, are still prevented from working there, but a short while ago we received this report from the British correspondent, John Snow.
Until this evening, the focus of attention here had shifted right away from the American embassy, but the Canadian crew, in evacuating undetected with American diplomats, has raised the temperature. Canada's embassy here was locked and shuttered this afternoon, but there was no indication of the finality of the closure or the identity of those who'd abandoned it. Iranians outside told us they'd been asked yesterday to come back for visas today, a sign that the Canadians had gone to considerable lengths to protect the secret of their departure. That there had been Americans inside the embassy was a complete surprise to members of Iran's Revolutionary Council who were in session as the news broke. Foreign Minister Gobsadeh was first disbelieving and then furious when we asked for his reaction as he left the meeting. I spent the morning inside the U.S. Embassy with the students who are holding the diplomat hostages there. At that stage, the students had no idea of what had happened. Tonight, when I spoke to them, they were confused, suspicious, and angry. Nevertheless, the escape has suddenly refocused attention on the hostages and is bound to harden already very immovable attitudes inside the embassy. Outside, it felt unlikely that it will substantially reawaken the old hostilities. John Snow, Independent Television News, Tehran.
Ambassador Taylor kept his secret very well. He was, ironically, the most accessible of diplomats in Tehran. Journalists like myself visited his embassy and his home regularly, and there was never the slightest hint that American diplomats were in hiding. Other ambassadors in Tehran today say they are equally surprised. Max?
Well, as usual, we'll have a special report tonight on the situation in Iran and Afghanistan at 11:30, 10:30 Central Time.